Good evening. My name is Jim Ludis. I'm the Executive Director of the Pell Center. And before we get started, because sometimes we don't get a chance to do this, people please join me in thanking Teresa for all that she does for all of these events to make them so successful. Thank you, Teresa. We've got a great speaker tonight and a great topic. Tonight's speaker came very highly recommended to us last year after the New England Association of Schools and Colleges annual meeting up in Boston. Several of my colleagues here came back and said, we heard from a remarkable speaker and he ought to come to the Pell Center. That night I got a phone call from my mom, who was also at that event, and said, you got to hear this speaker. And so I'm very pleased to report that tonight I can call my mom and say, Mom, he was here, he was great. Eric Mazur is the Balkanski Professor of Physics and Applied Physics at Harvard University and Dean of Applied Physics. He's a prominent physicist, known for his contributions in nano photonics, an internationally recognized educational innovator, a sought-after lecturer, and a successful entrepreneur. You can take a look at his bio in the program, but we're very thrilled to have you here tonight, sir. So without further ado, let's let you get started. Eric Mazur.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's a great pleasure to be here. And it's a great time to be talking about education, because we're sort of coming from a time where information was static, curated by libraries and universities, to an era where information is constantly changing and available everywhere. You don't have to go to a university or a library anymore. So things are changing. I'm here to talk about innovation. And I'd like to start by telling you a little story about a colleague of mine, this man here, Andrew Geim, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics a few years ago. And what is interesting about him is that he not only got the Nobel Prize 10 years earlier, and he's the only person to actually have gotten these two awards, he got the Ig Nobel Prize. I don't know if you know about that prize. It's awarded every year on my campus, a little bit before the Nobel Prize, typically in November. And it's awarded for science that makes you laugh at first, but think thereafter. It's based on real patent applications and papers. For example, the physics Ig Nobel Prize, I have to cheat and look on my phone because I keep forgetting and my brain can't remember that. But a few years ago, the physics prize was given to a man who had written a paper with the title, a paper in a peer-reviewed journal, no less, was the title, Dizziness in Discus Throwers is related to motion sickness generated while spinning. And then I forgot which prize it was, but it was also an Ig Nobel Prize. It was given for a bra, a patent filed for a bra that could quickly be converted into face masks. Here you see the inventor trying it out on some of my colleagues on the stage of Sanders Theater. Now, most people who get awarded the Ig Nobel Prize don't know exactly what it is, so they travel to Harvard and they appear in Sanders Theater, which is in front of the Science Center, which is a big theater. And one of my colleagues, who is a Nobel Prize laureate, Dudley Hirschbach, actually awards the prize. In the audience are over 1,000 students. The award winner gets about a minute to explain what he or she was doing or what it is about, and meanwhile the audience throws paper airplanes at the winner. Well, André Geim won the Ig Nobel Prize in 2010 for levitating a frog. And he actually came out to Harvard and accepted the Ig Nobel Prize. And 10 years later, he won the Nobel Prize. Now, it's really interesting to look at the website of the Nobel Foundation. You know, whenever somebody gets a Nobel Prize, they get interviewed, and the interview is posted on the Nobel Organization's website. And the interview with André Geim is actually very revealing, because on that interview, and during that interview, he says, for me, it's very boring to work on the same thing year after year. And the experiments that led to the discovery of graphene, which is what he was awarded, let me tell you what it is, by the way, because it's really interesting, what he was awarded the Nobel Prize for. So the graphene, to interrupt my story here, is basically a single layer of carbon atoms. If you take a pencil and write with graphite, it's a form of carbon that consists of layers of carbon atoms. The atoms hold each other very tightly in one layer, but the different layers peel off quite easily from one another, which is why you can write with graphite, and which is why we use pencils. He isolated a single layer of carbon atoms called graphene by taking Scotch tape and a pencil, putting some graphite on the sticky side of the Scotch tape, pulling out another little piece of Scotch tape, gluing it on top of the first one, sticky sides together, separating the two, and he noticed that some graphite stuck to one side and some to the other. He discarded half, took another little fresh piece of Scotch tape, put it on there, and exfoliated, basically, if you want, the layers of graphite, until at some point he noticed that it either was completely transparent or, you know, just faintly attenuating the light. And he surmised that at that time he had isolated a single layer of carbon atoms, and indeed he had. It was macroscopic, you know, large in the transverse dimension, but in the thickness it was just a single atomic layer. This is, you may have heard of nanotechnology, you know, technology at the nanoscale. This is nanotechnology, but nanotechnology on a nano budget, right? I mean, all you need is a piece of Scotch tape. Anyway, he says in that interview that graphene, and probably levitating the frog too, resulted from Friday night experiments where he encouraged his graduate student to just take whatever equipment was lying around and try something very basic, very simple, in order to push the research into a new direction. Of course, most of these attempts lead to nothing. But occasionally, you may win an Ig Nobel Prize. And if you're very lucky, you might win a Nobel Prize. So I think this little story illustrates something really important, namely that in order to, you know, have a real breakthrough, in order to be really innovative, you need to take risk. In fact, the road to innovate, any innovation or any creative process, in a sense, is just not related to innovation. I mean, this applies to creativity just as much as innovation. The road to creativity and the road to innovation is littered with failure. Take Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb. He didn't just fabricate the light bulb, no. 299 out of 300 prototypes didn't work, until finally there was one that worked. Most of the Friday night experiments carried out by Andre Geim didn't work, until there was one that was finally working. So I'd like to tell you tonight about my attempts to really try to foster this creativity or innovation. And I think, you know, I'm going to do my best not to have you fall asleep. But if you want to know what I'm going to aim at, it's this. I think we need to teach real problem solving. And you know, most of my colleagues in academia and anywhere around the world, if they're teaching a scientific subject or any critical thinking subject, they'll say, well, I do teach problem solving. I've italicized the word problem there because I think that most problem solving that is done in academia and in K-12 education too is not authentic problem solving. I'll get back to that a little later. So it has to be real authentic problem solving. And lastly, or secondly, I should say, we should encourage risk-taking. It is important to create an environment where students are comfortable with risk. And unfortunately, again, our approach to teaching actually discourages risk-taking, as I will argue in just a minute. Now, you all have these little devices in front of you, and you may wonder, what is it? They're called clickers. And it's very dangerous to start a talk about education with technology, because so many people think that technology is the solution to all problems in education. I love technology. You can find all the latest gadgets in my pockets, and I'm an early adopter of everything, so I can't wait for the new iOS tomorrow. No, I'll be the first one to download it. But I am very skeptical about the use of technology in education. Why? Because most use of technology in education is simply old wine into new bottles, a new way of doing an old thing. Why would projecting PowerPoint slides be better than writing by hand on the blackboard? Why would a smart board be better than a blackboard? We don't need smart boards, we need smart students. Anyway, so I think that people have put their hopes up way too high with technology, and it's much more important to think about the pedagogy. My talk today is actually about the pedagogy, which is why I don't really like to start with technology. But since you have these things hanging around your neck, I thought I'd show you how they work. There's no on-off button, they're always on, and if I ask you a multiple choice question and you want to answer 4, you press on the button 4, and if you change your mind, you press on 5. This doesn't mean you get to vote twice. The 5 overrides the 4. There's one button on which you should not push, which is the channel button at the bottom left. That's to change the transmission channel, right? Because people in a neighboring lecture hall may also want to use the clickers, and you don't want students in one lecture hall to answer a question in a neighboring hall. So we're set to a channel. If you accidentally press on it, don't worry. The little light will flash for a while. When it stops flashing, you're all right. And I think you should have the model that has a window. So if you press on 5, you can see the 5 in the window. Let me show you what I see. I have this little thing that floats in front of my display. God, I see that 36 of you have already been playing with your clicker. That's very good. I like that. I like that. Why don't you all push on the button? Go ahead. And you see each time somebody clicks, the number goes up. Now, if you've already clicked and you clicked again, that number will not go up. So we know that we have around 100 people here in the audience. I can, at any point, I can display the distribution. I see that many of you took my pressing number 5 very literally. Why don't you all press number 1 now? Oh, I love it when audiences follow my instructions. And notice that instantly the display reflects the new buttons you have clicked. If I press this stop button, it freezes the display. Now you can click as much as you want. Nothing happens anymore. In fact, if you press on a button, you'll see a circle with a line in it which says that the answer is no longer recorded because the voting is not open. That's all there is to it, which I think is important, because when you're teaching, you don't want to be struggling with technology, neither as a student nor as an instructor. Turn the clicker around for just a minute. Look at the back side. And you'll see that on the back side there's this barcode. Each clicker has a unique ID number. So you may think that you're sitting here anonymously, but no, each time you press that button, it sends not only the button you press, but the ID number as well. Of course, I don't know which ID number you're holding, so for all practical purposes, you are anonymous here. But in a real class, you could actually track individual responses if you so choose. So put the clicker away for now. I would like you, if you have something to write on, to take that, a little piece of paper and a pen, or if you have a smartphone, you can, take a blank page, but I want you to write down something very personal, and you will not have to reveal it, okay? So as soon as you've written it down, but I want you to commit to it, as soon as you've written it down, you can hide it so that your neighbor can't see what you wrote down. I want you to think of something you're really good at. And you're all successful individuals, so it shouldn't take too long to come up with something you're proud of, something you know other people respect you for, It could be gardening, it could be baking cakes, it could be photography, it could be solving partial differential equations, it could be making electronic circuits. I mean, whatever. I'm just trying to give you some ideas here. Don't take me as literally as when I told you to press button 5. I want you to come up with your own ideas. And ideally, I want you to write something that has been important in your career. Right? So unless you're a baker, baking cakes will probably not be the thing you choose. Okay. Now, usually when I'm in an academic environment, there's always somebody who raises his hand and said, only one thing? Yeah, only one thing. Good. Does anybody need more time? No? Okay, so now hide whatever you've written down. No need to show it to anybody. It's, as I said, it's personal information. I had you write this down because I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, and the follow-up question is a lot harder. The follow-up question is, how did you become good at whatever it is that you wrote down? What were the circumstances that led you to develop that skill or that ability or that knowledge? Where did you learn it? How? How did you become good at it? I can see it once from your face that that's a much more puzzling question, right? Because usually when we're good at something, we enjoy it. And when we enjoy it, we learn without really being aware how we learn. But dig deep into your past and write down a few words describing where or how or what the circumstances were that led you to become good at whatever it is that you wrote down. Incidentally, I have done this little exercise all around the world. I've done it in Chile, all the way down to Patagonia, near Isla del Fuego. I've done it in Colombia. I've done it in Mexico. I've done it in Canada. I've done it in Alaska. I've done it in Europe. A month and a half ago, I was in Egypt just before the whole situation unraveled there. I did it in Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, South Africa, Malaysia, Japan, Singapore. And I've had, in all places, hundreds of people click on their clickers. And there's something really interesting about the answers to the second question. There are no cultural differences. Yes, there are cultural differences between the people in China and Chile, but in terms of the way they learn, in terms of the way they report becoming good at something they're good at, there are no cultural differences. And perhaps that's not so surprising because we're all human beings and our brains are all wired the same way to learn. Now, I've never done this in Newport, Rhode Island before. In fact, I don't think I've ever done it in Rhode Island. So this is adding a data point to my extended global research project here. So let's see if the people of Newport, Rhode Island are any different. Does anybody need more time? No? Okay. So I have actually collected the answers to the second question, and they fall into 4 different broad categories. I became good at it by trial and error. I became, by doing it, making mistakes, and then learning from my mistakes. I became good at it by listening to lectures. The word listening is not on there, but somebody pointed out once, and you have to be very careful when you're in an academic environment, lectures could be giving lectures. And as every teacher knows, the person who's teaching is usually the person who learns the most. So that's not what I mean by point number 2. It's listening to lectures. I became good at it by practicing. I became good at it by apprenticeship, by tagging along with somebody who is really good at it and then learning from that master. I became good at it through some other things like friends or family and so on. So please select whichever of these 5 choices is closest to what you wrote down, and then we'll see if you are any different from the rest of the world. I'm sure you're curious to know that. So I'm going to give you a few more seconds. Click away. And here we go. There's the distribution. And no, you're right smack in the middle, typically between something like 50 and 70% report that they became good at it by practicing We learn by practicing. We learn by doing. So you can relax. You're no different from the rest of the world. But you know, this is not why I did this little exercise. I did this little exercise because there's something else really peculiar about the distribution behind me. Well, of course, there's somebody who answered G. I don't know what that is, but let's ignore that one. There's something else really interesting there. What is it? Let me move it sideways so you see which choice is what. It's right in front of the choices, pardon me. What is it? Lectures. Nobody chose, well, nobody, one poor soul in this room chose lectures, maybe even giving lectures, but you know, that's kind of odd, because how do we teach? This is how we teach. I mean, look at this space. We're in an academic environment, and wherever you go, you know, from high school on, you see chairs facing the instructor. So that's kind of odd, right? Because teaching all around the globe, 99.9% of all classes taught take place in this format. But you've just told me that something you're really, really good at, you did not learn by listening to a lecture. This actually, incidentally, is a picture of me lecturing. It's a very old picture. I was still an assistant professor at Harvard. This picture was taken BC, before computers. I'm using an overhead projector, as you can see. So here's what I'd like to do now that we have seen this rather odd contrast between how we learn and how we teach. I'd like to talk a little bit about education. What is it that we mean by education? What is education? If I were to ask you to take a little piece of paper and to write down a concise definition of the word education, I think many of you would struggle, including me. And you know, I'm an educator, so I should know what I mean by education. But it's one of these terms where you know what you mean, but to articulate exactly what it is actually much more difficult than you think. Well, we're educators, many of us here in the audience, so we better know what education is. Then I'd like to talk about an approach that I developed after discovering that my teaching, as shown here, in spite of getting, you know, really very good reviews, was not very effective at teaching. And then I thought, since I'm in an academic environment, I should end this lecture by test. So you better pay attention, because otherwise you're going to have problems. So let's start by asking the question, what is it exactly that happens in a lecture? Let's go back to this picture. In fact, you know, why did I teach that way? I started teaching at Harvard in 1984, and when they told me to teach introductory physics to pre-meds, if I think back of that moment, the odd thing is that I never asked myself the question, how am I going to teach? Which is kind of strange, right? Because when you do something new in your life, the first question you should ask yourself is, how am I going to do it? The question did not come up in my mind. It was clear what I was going to do. I was going to do to my students what my professors had done to me. And what happened was that, you know, very quickly I received signs that I was doing the right things. What are the ways in which we evaluate the quality of education? I'm sure it's no different in this institution and in any others. At the end of the term, we ask the students to rate the professor. Now, usually when physicists teach pre-meds, there's not a happy moment when it comes to the evaluation. In fact, the reason that I was asked to teach it as an assistant professor was because none of my colleagues wanted to teach that course. They would come close to committing suicide at the end of the term. But not so for me. I got a 4.5, 4.2 out of 5. So clearly the students liked what I was doing in the classroom. So that's one metric. The other metric was the exam problems. Normally, when physics is taught to pre-meds, it's sort of a watered-down version of the physics we teach to physicists. Well, for example, we avoid calculus, but not so at Harvard. We'll give them a full-blown calculus-based course. And I could put on the exam some questions I wasn't even sure I could do well under the pressure of an exam, but by and large, my students did well. So in short, they liked me as an instructor. They did well on what I consider to be complicated exam questions. Obviously, I was doing the right thing. Now, in retrospect, there were always some disturbing signs. But you see, I'm a positive thinker, so if I get positive signs and negative signs, I ignore the negative ones and I focus on the positive ones. See, some students, they would give me a high rating, and then in the comment section at the bottom of the form, they would write, "Physics is boring," or "Physics sucks." I could never make any sense. I mean, what's more interesting than understanding how the world around us works? So to me, it didn't make any sense at all, and therefore I ignored it. Same thing happens when I go to a party and people ask me what I do for a living, and I tell them I'm a physicist. They say, "Oh, physics? I had such a hard time with physics in high school or in college." Or my dentist, who recently told me, you know, and I couldn't even talk back because I had the thing in my mouth. He said, "Oh, you're a physicist. I got an A for physics in college, but I really didn't understand anything." It always creates this discomfort and embarrassment. And I could never understand why the teaching of science would cause so much frustration. So, you know, when you don't understand something, you're more tempted to ignore it. And I focused on my high ratings. And for many, many years, I thought I was doing a really good job. Okay, let's get back to that question that I posed and almost skipped over. What is it that happens in a lecture? Let's look at this picture. I want you to describe in a few words the process that is occurring there on the screen. One or two. Just say some things that come to mind. There are two, and ideally use a verb. But the two verbs I do not want to hear are teaching and learning. So go ahead, just blurt it out. Listening. Speaking, talking, dreaming, sleeping. Who said sleeping there? These are my students. But you know, now that you mentioned sleeping, I can't resist quoting a French author, Albert Camus, who once said, "Some people talk in their sleep. Lecturers talk while other people are sleeping." At the end of my talk, I will show you some data from MIT that are truly amazing, that actually show that this is actually the truth. But that comes later. That's just to keep you with some advertisement, you know, for the end. After the break, I'll come back to that. Okay, so all the verbs we've heard so far refer either to me, talking, or to the students, sleeping, listening, and so on. Is there a way that we can encapsulate the whole process?
Passive.
Passive, but passive. I'm not passive. I mean, I'm standing there just gesticulating and talking. So we're again to the students.
Information transfer?
You must have heard my talk before. That's exactly what I'm after. Lectures focus on the transfer of information. Some people sometimes say on the transfer of knowledge, but you know, I don't know how to transfer knowledge. Knowledge is something that needs to be constructed in the brain of the learner. I can only transfer information. And you know what? My students had actually rubbed that in my face very early in my teaching career, and I had ignored it. You see, when I was assigned this course, I didn't ask myself, how am I going to teach? Put yourself in my position. What would be the question you ask?
What?
Exactly, what, or more precisely, what book? So I went to a colleague who had taught the course before, and he said, "Oh, in this course we use a book by Halliday and Resnick." Those of you who've had physics 30 years ago may actually remember that book because it's been around. It's still around, believe it or not. Anyway, I had been educated in Europe, and in Europe, at the University of Leiden, where I was educated, you would never buy a textbook for an introductory course. I mean, why spend the money if the professor is presenting the content of the book to you? But I was told that in the US, or at Harvard, the students would buy the book, and I had to be sure that there were enough copies of Halliday and Resnick at the Harvard Coop, which is the bookstore in Harvard Square. So 2 weeks before the semester started, I went to the Coop and I said, make sure that by September 15th you have 150 copies of Halliday and Resnick. And so I went back to my office. I thought, wait a minute. If the students have the book, and I have the same book, then what do I talk about in class? So I went to my colleague's office, I knocked on his door, and I asked him that question. He said, oh, don't worry. There are lots of different physics textbooks. And he showed me a shelf full of physics textbooks. And I started to look, and very quickly, I found the perfect book. It was perfect for two reasons. The first reason was, it was different from Halde and Resnick, so at least I was not just regurgitating the book that the students had bought. But that was not the important reason. The important reason was the book was out of print. So for every lecture, I spent, 10 hours preparing lecture notes, and then in class I would either project the lecture notes on the overhead projector or write them on the board behind me. And because my lecture notes were somewhat different from the textbook, I thought, you know what? I'm going to give copies of my lecture notes to the students. So as they walked out of the classroom in the back at the end of the lecture period, there were stacks of photocopied notes which they could take home with them. Now, why do you think I handed them out at the end of class and not at the beginning of class? So they would listen to me. But isn't that already admitting that there's something wrong? Why force them to get the information out of my mouth if they could get them from the printed notes? Well, that never came up in my brain. But what did happen was that at the end of that semester, about half a dozen students wrote at the bottom in the comment section of their evaluation form, they wrote, Professor Mazur is lecturing straight from his lecture notes. Hello? I mean, what was I supposed to do? Develop another set of lecture notes to lecture from that was different from the lecture notes I handed out to them? I was livid. These ungrateful students. But they were right. I was lecturing from my lecture notes. Now, given the fact that this model that you're laughing about, that we're collectively laughing about here, is so pervasive and used all around the world. We could ask ourselves the question, I don't think it's a crazy question, we could ask ourselves the question, is that what education is? Is education simply the transfer of information? We have these clickers, and I want to keep you engaged here, so let's actually use these clickers here. So if you believe, or if you agree with the statement that education is just the transfer of information, press 1. If you think education is more than just the transfer of information, press 2.
Is that as it stands, what you see in school today?
No. Not what I see in school today, what it should be. What education really is. Education as we want it. Okay, we have 101, so let's see where we stand here. There it is. Well, 2% chose yes. It's probably the same person who said yes, but who learned from lectures. One person said H. I don't know what's going on there. But I am happy to see that we have a pretty unanimous agreement on 2. Let me talk first to that 1 or 2 people who said yes. I have a warning. If you're a teacher, you're about to lose your job. Because let's imagine, for a moment, let's imagine that education is just the transfer of information. In that case, what would be the logical thing to do? What would be, in this 21st century, what would be the pragmatic thing to do?
Read the book.
Read the book, or film it and put it online, right? I mean, just film it and put it online. Because, whether you watch a picture of a person talking that was filmed or a live person, the same information is transferred. What would you lose by doing that? What would you lose by taking the best professor of every subject, in different languages, of course, and putting it on the web? One is you would lose your job, right? We'd lose all our job, and universities would be in big. And in fact, to some degree, that's already happening with MOOCs. I happen not to be a believer in MOOCs at all, but in addition to losing our jobs, what would we lose? I think I heard somebody say, interaction. But how much interaction is there in a real lecture? I'm working really, really hard on interacting with you, and I'll get you to interact more later, I promise you that. But in most lectures, there's hardly any interaction. You know, I make a habit of going into classrooms around campus and dropping into random classes, psychology, biology, other physicists. And you know, you see all these fantastic professors give brilliant lectures. And they talk and talk and talk, and then they stop and they say, does anybody have a question? Anybody? And the students look down, they don't want to make eye contact, you know. And if the professor waits long enough that it gets painful, it's always the same person in the front row reluctantly raises his or her hand and says something. Most people do not want to interact. In fact, this architecture, by the way, where does it come from? The architecture of this room and that room. Where does it come from? Who invented that? The ancient Greek, the amphitheater. Now the Greek were smart enough not to use this as a learning space. It was a performance space. Poetry, theater, music, but not for teaching. If you look at an illustration of the school of Athens, you see something very different. You see people walk around in pairs, talking to each other, teaching each other semi-Socratically. Somewhere after the Middle Ages, something went wrong in education. We adopted the Greek performance space as a learning space. When you walk in, think back of the moment you walked into this room before my talk started. As soon as you sit down in a seat in an amphitheater, you put in a passive role. You don't expect to interact. You expect to observe. So the space by itself already puts you in a passive role. So I don't think we'd lose much interaction by putting it online. In fact, I would argue we gain a lot by putting it online, because we actually create the opportunity to think. Have you ever had a student in your class raise his hand and say, "Professor, could you please be quiet for 10 minutes? I need to think." I've never had that happen in my classes, and I've taught quite a few years. Or have you had a student raise her hand and say, "Professor, could you please repeat the last 15 minutes? I need to hear it again." Well, you know, when you're watching online, if you want to think, you pause. You hit the pause button, and the same thing when you read a book. You can put the book down and think. When you're in a lecture, you cannot think, because as soon as you start thinking and your mind starts wandering, you can no longer listen to the information that comes in. As soon as you start thinking about something, you know, you lose whatever comes in. Our brains are just not made to multitask. We either listen or we think. We cannot do both at a deep cognitive level at the same time. But, you know, I'm happy to see that 7% of us agrees that education is more. Since I've been picking on the 2% who said yes, let me now turn to the 97%. Since you said no, you must agree that there is something more than education. I want to hear from you what that is. What is it?
Experience.
Experience. Internalization, which, you know, is kind of a vague word, right? So can we define it a little bit better? Problem solving. Think of the little exercise that we did at the beginning. Practicing, right? You need to do something. As a learner, it's not just opening your skull, putting the information in, closing your skull, and done. You need to do something with that information. You need to make sense of the information, connect it to your experiences. Build the mental models that allow you to apply whatever knowledge is embedded in that information in a new context. You know, I think it was 2 years ago, I was giving a talk at a university in Connecticut. I won't name any names, a respected university. And in the physics department. And after my talk, one of the physics professors came to me and said, I'd had something really strange happen in my classroom this year. He wanted to make physics relevant to his engineering students that he was teaching. And in order to make it relevant, he put physics in a real-world context. And the context he used was baseball. I mean, there's a lot of physics in baseball, right? Trajectories of balls, collisions between balls and bats, runners running. So in class, he would use examples from baseball. On the homework, he would put baseball problems. On the midterm examinations, he'd put baseball problems. At the end of the semester, he was preparing the final exam, and he realized he had run out of baseball problems. So he put some football problems on the exam. Professor, complained the students, we've never done any football problems. You're laughing about it, but I think we really should be crying about it, right? You recognize some of the students you may have taught, or maybe even some of your own experiences when you were assessed in a context that was very different from the one you learned it in. But let's face it, being able to transfer your knowledge from one context to another, that is actually the real hallmark of learning and education. Our students are not going to be encountering their textbook problems in real life. I want my students to stand on my shoulders so that they can reach higher. I want the next generation of students to be able to solve the problems that this generation cannot yet solve. I mean, there are a lot of problems to figure out, conflict, you name it. Engineering problems, science problems. We want the next generation of students to be able to solve those, not just solve the problems we can solve. So transferring your knowledge, and maybe that's what you meant by internalizing, is something I think that is really important. Well, it took many, many years before I discovered that my teaching was not very effective. After teaching for about 7 years and getting my high, you know what happens, by the way, when you get high rating from students, what happens? You get punished. They ask you to teach the same course again the next year. So I basically was asked for many, many years to teach this introductory physics course, and I sort of fooled myself into believing that I was a really successful and good teacher. But then around 1990, I read about a test that asked some very simple, basic, word-based questions about physics. And the test had shown, the professor who'd written it was at Arizona State University, and he had used this test in high schools, physics high school classes and in college classes all around the Southwest, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. And he showed that there was not much difference between the results you get at the end of a one-year course and at the beginning. In other words, if you ask the questions at the beginning of the term and then you repeat them at the end, you don't see much difference. And in fact, quite a few students score significantly lower than what you would get if you put a gorilla behind a keyboard just clicking random keys, because they consistently choose the wrong answers. I looked at that and I thought, no way. You know, after all these data were from the Southwest of the United States. Maybe there was some disease going on in that part of the country. Surely my students, my Harvard students, would do much better. But you know, I'm a scientist, so one thing I learned is not just to make a statement like this. I thought, I'm going to show that in my class, things are very, very different. Now, unfortunately, it was too late to do a pre-test at the beginning of the year. We were already, you know, halfway into the year, but I was dying to know how my students were doing. So one day, I walked into the classroom and I said to my students, look, I'm going to give you a quiz. The reason I used the word quiz was, you know, these are pre-meds, right? You say the word test and they freak out, so I just didn't want to make them nervous. So I said, I'm going to give you a quiz, and you don't have to worry about this quiz. It's just to test the effectiveness of my teaching. It will not affect your final grade in any way. As I said that, I realized I'd just taken away any incentive for them to even take this quiz. I mean, you know how pre-meds are, right? It doesn't affect your final grade. Forget about it, right? So I thought I better give them a reason to take this quiz seriously. So I said, look, in 2 weeks we have a midterm exam coming up. If you take this quiz seriously, it's a way of testing your own knowledge, and then you can improve your performance on the midterm. As soon as I said that, I realized I told them a huge lie, because, you know, the midterm was dealing with all kinds of complicated textbook problems, and these were, in my view, just trivial word-based questions that were, you know, maybe at the high school level. So I was worried that my students would be offended by the simplicity of this test. Oh boy, were my worries quickly dispelled, because hardly had they started to take this test, or one student raised her hand, and she asked, Professor Mazur, how should I answer these questions? According to what you taught me, or according to the way I usually think about these things? I had no idea how to answer that question. I was just totally flabbergasted. And by the time the test had been completed, it was clear that there was something very wrong in my class, and that the students had not really internalized, if you want, the information. Yes, they were able to solve textbook problems, but they did it completely by rote, not by understanding. And then I have to agree, physics is boring. Physics sucks, because, you know, you learn this trick and you can apply it in one situation, but then in another, and it doesn't make sense. The beauty of doing science is totally, completely, utterly lost. So, lack of learning, lack of retention. In fact, my group has studied retention in STEM disciplines and retention of knowledge. I wish I had more time to show you the data, because I think it's really important to show data, but we want to get on to this test that I'm going to give you at the end, so I will not show you data. If you want, you can download them on my website. So it's not really the transfer of information that is the key, but it's the assimilation of that information. Piaget would have called it the accommodation of the information, but I'm using a slightly different word here. Making sense of that information. By the way, I've never asked myself that question. Where did that happen for us? Where did it happen for you, for me? Where did you have the aha moment? Oh, I get it now. Did that happen while you were in the classroom, listening to your professors teach? I see a lot of people shake. No. Maybe sometimes it happens in the classroom that you go, oh, but most times it went, outside of classroom, when you had a chance to think about it, to look over your notes, to look over the textbook. It's kind of ironic that this harder part of the education, the sense-making, takes place not in our learning spaces, but outside of them. There's only one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is this. I don't need to say any words. You see right away what is going on here, right? What is this?
Test.
Yeah. Does this image evoke pleasant memories? If it does, I would like to speak to you after my talk. What kind of sense does it give you when you see this picture, other than maybe stress and painful memories? What kind of, when you look at this picture, how would you, what kind of word comes to mind?
Uniformity.
Uniformity. What did you say, Jim? Sympathy. Not from the students to the instructor. Let's hear some more. Individualized. Yeah, that's close to where I want to get. But there's something else. I mean, we could say we're still individuals here, too. But there's something else really peculiar about this situation.
You know, it's like prison. Prison.
Prison. Why prison?
Because they're each in their little cells.
Ah, very good. They're each in their little cells.
Isolated.
Isolated. That was exactly the word I was thinking about. They're all completely, utterly isolated. They're isolated from each other, and they're isolated from any source of information. If we could, we'd strip them down to their underwear to make sure that they are not bringing in information. Let me ask you another question. Have you ever after graduating from college, I'm sure there are some people who are still in college here, but for those of you who made it out of college, have you ever encountered any situation in your professional life that resembles this? No. In real life, we can talk to each other. We can look up anything we want. When I write a paper on nanophotonics in my office, there's nobody standing next to me slapping my hand saying, you're not allowed to look up the paper by your colleague at Yale. You should have known it by heart. I can look up whatever I want. And now that information is so ubiquitous, there's actually even less need to memorize and remember. It's not about memorizing information. It's about knowing what to do with the information that matters. In fact, I would argue that in the 21st century, just as robots have eliminated assembly line jobs, so will computers eliminate any job that has to do with information retrieval or, with rote procedure, because computers can't do that. So that brings me to the assessment, because I think, in a sense, the assessment has become the silent killer of learning, of deep learning. Let's talk about this problem solving that I mentioned before. What is a real problem? In the case of a real problem, you have a desired outcome. You're a hedge fund manager. You are managing big funds. The outcome is pretty clear: more money. Or you're an emergency room doctor. A patient is brought in on a stretcher. You can at once see that that patient is in bad shape. The outcome is getting that patient better. That's clear. What is not known is the road that leads to that outcome, right? For example, you might not have all the time in the world to do all possible tests and to look everything up about this patient. You've got to handle quickly now. And probably the patient that is brought in a stretcher is not a textbook case. So in any real-world problem, the outcome is known, but the road to that outcome is unknown. If you evaluate, and I've evaluated many assessment instruments, if you look at most assessments that we give to our students, both in K-12 education and in higher ed, they follow a very different pattern. You have a question or a problem, and the students are asked to apply a known procedure to find an unknown answer. So it's a known procedure and an unknown answer. Take a physics problem. A car is going around the road, driving around the road, and then it hits a tree. What is the velocity of the car as it hit the tree? Well, as a student, you think, well, you have to come up with an answer, the velocity of that car, so I'm going to look for an equation that gives me the velocity of the car, and then plug the numbers in and get the answer. So the procedure is known, the outcome is unknown. Do you see the difference between these two? One is focused on the answer, the other is focused on the procedure. And I would argue in the 21st century, we have computers to do that. So any job that will require procedural problem solving is at risk, because why would we dedicate a human being to doing that if we can get a much more patient and much less prone to error machine to do that? So what we should really focus on in education is the top type of problem, which I would call an authentic problem. Remember, we laughed a moment ago about the students who told us, Professor, we've never done any football problems. But think about it. If you had done a problem of a particular type, it would by definition no longer be a problem. Right? You solve a problem, it's no longer a problem. So that's why we should really focus on that top category. But there's something really disconcerting about it. Because when you're searching for the right procedure rather than the right answer, the road is not clear. You may try one approach, it might not work. Just like inventing the light bulb took 299 or 300 tries, solving a problem might take several tries. You try approach 1, doesn't work. You try approach 2, it doesn't work. Finally, maybe, if you're lucky, approach 3 works. There's a lot of uncertainty and risk in that process. And unfortunately, I think that our evaluation methods are not compatible with risk. Why? Because if you make an error, you get points off. Students are deathly afraid of making mistakes. But I would argue that making mistakes is key to being innovative or creative. So we really need to rethink our assessment practices. The traditional assessment focuses on the outcome, not the process, discourages risk-taking, focuses on the individual instead of the group. Later in life, we work as a group. You know, industry complains about how engineering students don't know how to collaborate. Well, they don't know how to collaborate because they never have a chance to try out their collaboration skills. And lastly, I think most of our assessment does not mirror the future work environment. Okay, I'm talking too much here. So education, as I see it now, is a two-step process. Information transfer and then assimilation of that information. In the standard approach, 1 takes place in class and 2 takes place out of class. But we should really focus on the second one. So when I discovered that my students weren't learning anymore, I said, you know, I should really invert these two. Do 1 out of class and 2 in class. Now, there's a lot of discussion about how to do that first step. Although we've had the right tools for over 500 years. In 1430-something, Gutenberg invented the printing press, and we had a fantastic vehicle for transferring information. In fact, in the 18th century, Samuel Boswell said, you know, why do we need to use lectures in education other than maybe, he literally said that, I don't know exactly why he said it, other than the making of shoes and chemistry. Because the lectures, how can the lectures be better than the books they're taken from? And here we are, hundreds of years later, and we're still really teaching by reading books. So I'm going to really talk about this second. What do you do in the class if you have had your students read the material before coming to class? And the answer is really nothing new either. Teach by questioning. Who said that first, by the way? Socrates. And here we're 2,000 years later, and we're still teaching mostly by telling. Ironically, I'm giving you a lecture about the fallacy of the lecture. So rather than telling, I come into class and I ask the students a question. And I give them 1 or 2 minutes to think about the question in silence. Then they commit themselves to an answer. I polled them with these clickers or with other technologies, but for many years I used the clicker. Then I tell them, now turn to your neighbor and try to convince your neighbor of your answer. This was a totally serendipitous discovery. Remember that I told you that I was worried that my students would be offended by the simplicity of that assessment? They were not offended at all. They were all horrified. They asked me to go through every single question in class. But there was no time in class, so I booked one of our large classrooms at night. There were 250 students from 7 to 10. And I went through all 30 questions on this assessment instrument. And there was one question about a truck and a car colliding. And, you know, I thought it was a pretty trivial question. So I made some drawings on the board, and I said, you know, gave them what the answer was. I turned around. I could see that they were confused. So I asked them, is there a question? They were so confused they could not articulate a question. So I thought, this is serious. So I erased the board, and I thought, I start over again. Let me bring in Newton's second law. And I decided to, you know, add equations. I gave the most brilliant explanation you could possibly imagine. It took me 8 minutes. At the end of 8 minutes, the board was covered with equations, and I'd been standing with my back to them. I turned around, you know, my jacket was covered in chalk dust, only to see that they looked even more confused. And they could still not articulate a question. So I didn't know what to do. I tried for 10 minutes, 2 different ways. But I knew that half of them had given the right answer on that quiz. So in a moment of despair, I said, why don't you discuss it with each other? And something happened I had never seen in my classroom. Chaos erupted. They all started talking. They forgot about me in front of the class. I could have walked away. They would not have noticed it. And what happened was that in just 2 minutes, they figured it out. I thought, how can it be? I tried for 10 minutes. and they don't get it, and they talk for 2 minutes to each other and they get it. But imagine you have two students sitting next to each other, Mary and John. Mary has the right answer because she understands it. John does not. On average, Mary is more likely to convince John than the other way around. Simply the force of logic. But here's the key point. Mary is more likely to convince John than Professor Mazur is in front of the class. Because he's learned it such a long time ago. To him it is so clear that he can no longer understand why somebody doesn't understand it. Whereas Mary has only recently learned it and still knows what the difficulties are that a beginning learner has. It's what my colleague Steven Pinker calls the curse of knowledge. The more of an expert you become, the harder it is to understand the difficulties of a beginning learner. So after I poll them, I tell them to discuss it with their neighbor, and typically the percentage of right questions, provided it's large enough at the start, right? If nobody gets the question the first time, it doesn't make much sense to have them talk to each other. So you want roughly around 50% correct answers the first time around. I poll them again, I explain, or I have some students in the audience explain, and we try again. And then, of course, it's the discussion that's the key point. Let me show you a little video. So we have a rectangular loop that is placed in a uniform magnetic. So I read the question with them, indicated by these arrows. So the question is, 5 minutes. What are the magnetic forces on the Don't worry about this question, by the way, okay?
This loop. So take a minute to think about this and then enter your answers.
It's silent. I don't want them to talk here. I can see on my screen what the answer is. They do not see this distribution. Only I see it.
Disagreement clearly here. So turn to your neighbor and see if you can convince one another of the correct choice.
Right, it goes out of the page on the top, it goes in, so they cancel each other out. There is a torque. There is a torque.
How do you know that?
I said, what did you say? But it happens to be a torque.
So see the aha moment there? Ah.
Initially we had sort of an even split. And now we have an absolutely overwhelming majority for choice number 2.
And it's not unusual to go from 50-50 to 90-10 because in a sense you personalize the instruction, right? Because each student can sort of address the difficulty of the student who is still learning there. You want to try it? Okay. Did you all read those 2 paragraphs about thermal expansion? I'd asked Teresa to give everybody, no? I'm just kidding you. But you know, if you don't do any reading, then there's no point in asking questions. So I'll have to lecture you for, a few minutes. I'm actually very grateful because the thing that I miss about my method of instruction is that I don't get to lecture anymore. So I'm happy that I get to make up for it. Thermal expansion, solids expand in volume when they get hotter, and when they get colder they contract again. And in engineering this is very important. For example, when you lay railroads, you have to leave a little bit of space between the sections of the rail so they can expand. If you don't, and you may have noticed that when you're in a train, it goes at low speed, you hear this clickety-clack sound. That's because of these gaps. If they were to put the rails too close together, you get bad things that happen when the weather gets hotter. It will buckle because there's no space to expand lengthwise. And steel beam building, same thing. You need to take into account the expansion of the steel. All solids, some more than others, metals for example more than other solids, expand when they get hotter and contract again when they get colder. The reason is that they're made up from atoms, and atoms get further away from each other when it gets hotter. So this is cold and that's hot. Cold and hot. That's all there is to it. Now you may wonder, why are they getting further away from each other? I'm not going to test you on this, but just to satisfy your curiosity, let me explain. And because I love lecturing, let me explain it to you. Atoms don't sit still, they move back and forth. And the amplitude of that motion is what we call temperature. So these are cold atoms, and these are hot atoms. And as they vibrate over bigger amplitude, they need more space, and they push each other away. Right? So as they get colder again, they vibrate less, and because they attract each other, they can get closer together. So cold and hot. Questions, anyone? Wow, a very sharp audience here. Why is the middle one not moving? Well, the reason for that is that I made two drawings. One was the atoms closer together, and one was the atoms further apart. And then I centered it on the center atom. But I could just as well have put this black atom on top of that gray one. What would have happened to this one in that case? It would have gone down and to the right. And this one would have gone straight to the right. And that one would have gone to the right. And this one would have gone twice as far to the right and the bottom. What matters is not the absolute positions. It's how far they are from each other. Because even if I put this on top of that, this distance would have increased the same way it increases the way I've shown it now. And it's not just those 9 atoms, all of them, the millions of billions of atoms that made up a piece of material. So the absolute position is not what matters. What matters is the distance between them. They all have to get further away from each other. Any other question? Are you ready for my question? Now look, one thing I could do is just blacken out the screen and ask you, when metals get hotter, the metal expand because A, the atoms get closer together, B, they stay the same distance, C, they get further away from each other. But that would be just me giving information to you and you giving that same information back to me. Believe it or not, that's what happens in a lot of education, but that's not what I'm going to do here. I'm going to see if you can take this idea of the atoms getting further away from each other, all of them, and apply that in a new context. Are you ready for that? Yeah? Okay, let's try it then. So, consider a rectangular metal plate, there it is, underneath my little window here. I'm going to put that there, with a circular hole in it. Now, imagine we heat up this plate uniformly. What will happen to the diameter of the hole? Well, the diameter of the hole, I haven't even finished reading the question and people are already clicking. Think, okay? Will the diameter of the hole increase, decrease, or stay the same? So think, and you get to talk to your neighbor in just a second. If you're talking now, I'm going to come with this microphone and you're going to have to tell everybody what you tell your neighbor. No talking to each other yet. And if you've already answered, ask yourself, how am I going to convince the person next to me that I am right and he or she is wrong? And use this idea of atoms getting further away from each other, all of them. Okay, let's see how far we are. Wow, we're already at 90, 91. Okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to turn to a neighbor. If your neighbor has the same answer, say, thank you very much, and turn to a neighbor on the other side. You're not allowed to talk to somebody who has the same answer as you. If everybody around you has the same answer, don't assume I must be right. No, get up, walk. If I see you not talking, I'll come and talk to you, okay? So find somebody who has a different answer. Go ahead, talk to each other. Now look at that. You are all engaged. I bet that many of you have forgotten that I'm not here to talk about metal plates. I mean, you know, the answer to this question doesn't even really matter. I'm here to talk about education. Imagine I'd just given my little lecture, and then, you know, about the atoms getting further on, and then I, instead of asking you the question, I would have said, let's now apply this to rectangular metal plates with circular holes in it. If you take one of these plates, and you put it in the oven, and you, God, look at that, everybody's paying attention, it's just amazing. And you put that plate in the oven, and you turn up the temperature, the diameter of the hole will, I'm going to keep you in suspense a little bit longer here. Yeah? Would you have been as eager to know the answer? No, I mean, what is more boring than metal plates with circular holes in it, right? But by asking it as a question, it's very, very different, right? Now, before I tell you the answer, first of all, you need to vote again. So I would like you to answer what you now believe to be the correct answer. Could you do that for me, please? Okay, because otherwise, you know, we can't compare the before and the after. Okay, but before I tell you the answer, let's analyze what happened here. I asked you the question, you made a commitment, right? By pressing the button, you actually made a commitment. And after making the commitment, I asked you to externalize that answer. You have to turn to a neighbor and say, I chose because blah, blah, blah. And something really interesting happened there, namely, you moved away from the answer to the reasoning. I said that the hole would do this because blah, blah. It became about the reasoning, not about the answer. But most importantly, you became emotionally invested in the learning process, right? Even though this is, I mean, come on, this is totally boring, right? Metal plates with circular holes in it. But you're dying to know the answer. If I were to walk away now and say, sorry, I gotta get back, you'd come running after me, right? What is the answer? Okay. Well, I have some bad news for you. I thought I gave a pretty clear lecture, but only 32% of you got the answer right the first time. And you know, I mean, you need more than 30% for the answer to spread. That means that only 1 in 3, actually less than 1 in 3 people had the right answer here. So you've actually made a really important point. Because in essence, you've been telling me, Eric, your lecturing sucks. Of course, you should have done the reading. That's the real reason. So let's see what we get after the discussion. Here is the distribution. And the correct answer, I'm afraid, is not C. It is 1. And, you know, because there were so few correct answers before, the answer did not spread. I'll show you the oh, why can't I compare? Oh, here, compare with question 4, there. If I went down a little bit, I tried to aim my questions so that about half of them get it right. I can see many of you look at the screens, how can it be A and not B? I don't want you to lie in bed tonight thinking, so let me spend, even though I'm not here to talk about plates, let me tell you. Imagine you have a jar of jam in a refrigerator, a glass jar, metal lid. The metal lid is a ring and a metal plate. You take it out of the refrigerator, you try to open it, you can't open it. What do? Run it under hot water. The metal ring expands and the hole gets larger. You say, that's unfair. It's a lid. It's not a rectangular metal plate. Okay. Imagine we take a metal plate. I have a piece of paper here. But imagine that this is a metal plate. There's no hole in it. We draw a circle with a marker. We draw a circle with a marker. Now we take this plate with a drawn circle on it and put it in the oven. And the plate expands, gets bigger. What happens to the diameter of that circle that we have drawn? It gets bigger. Everything gets bigger. See, that's unfair. There's no hole. If there was a hole, then the atoms would expand into the hole, so you can't compare these two. Well, that's a good point. Imagine that we go outside. It's a little chilly, but we could do it. And we all hold hands, We are, make a big circle. We are the atoms at the edge of the hole. Now imagine that we all step inwards towards the center of the hole. What just happened to the distance between us? We get cramped together. Can't get cramped together because remember, our neighbor is shaking more, so it needs more space. The only way to make the distance between us larger is to make the hole larger. You won't forget this. And probably you've again forgotten that I'm here to talk about education. Okay, let me wrap up here. Back to PI. I have no time to show the data, but the first year that I implemented this, I doubled the learning gains. And over time, as I chose better questions, not questions like this one that only got 30% correct, but you should have done a reading. No, just kidding. I chose this question on purpose because I know only 30% gets it right. But if you choose right questions, you can triple the learning gain. And after I wrote my book about peer instruction, people start to implement it in chemistry, in engineering, in biology, in astronomy, and French drama. I mean, fields I could never even have imagined.